I always thought Rachel and I had a good thing going. I mean, sure, our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is, but we had a rhythm. We'd been together for over 10 years, married for 8, and had built a life that seemed solid enough. I worked hard to provide for us, juggling long hours at my job, while Rachel handled most of the home stuff. She worked too, but more part-time these days, focusing more on taking care of our 2 kids, Jason and Emily. They're everything to me. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and for the most part, life was predictable in that comforting sort of way. But looking back now, I guess I should have noticed that something wasn't quite right. Rachel had started to change, little by little, in ways that were subtle enough to brush off at first. She was always a bit fiery, but her temper seemed to flare up more often these days, over the smallest things. If I didn't put my shoes away or forgot to unload the dishwasher, she'd snap at me like I'd committed some cardinal sin. And don't even get me started on the bedroom situation. It used to be fun, spontaneous even, but lately, it felt like she was always too tired, too stressed, too something. It was easier just to let it slide, telling myself that we were just going through a rough patch. It wasn't just the sex that was missing, it was her, too. Rachel had started spending more time away from home. She'd come up with excuses: errands, meeting a friend, working late. I didn't think too much of it at first. Everyone needs their space, right? But then there were those nights when she'd go out, dressed up more than usual, and come back hours later with some vague explanation that didn't quite add up. I told myself not to overthink it, that she just needed time for herself. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then came the night that really set the alarm bells ringing. She was going out again, said she needed to pick up some things for the house. But it was the way she got ready, taking her time with her makeup, slipping on that red dress I hadn't seen in months. And when I noticed she'd put on the lace underwear that had pretty much gathered dust in the back of the drawer, something clicked in my head. Rachel was dressing up for someone, and I was pretty damn sure it wasn't me. She left around 7 p.m., giving me a peck on the cheek like everything was normal. But the whole time she was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I paced around the house, checked on the kids, even tried to distract myself with some mindless TV, but my mind kept going back to her, to where she might be, and who she might be with. She came back around midnight, looking flustered. When I asked her how the shopping went, she was vague, brushed off my questions like they were annoying flies. Said she just picked up a few things and ran into a friend. I pressed her a bit, but she snapped at me, saying I was being too controlling and paranoid. That stung, but I didn't push it further. I knew something was off, but I didn't have proof, just a gut feeling that my wife was slipping away from me. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention to the little things. She'd spend more time on her phone, always with it facing away from me or tucked under her pillow at night. I even noticed she'd started taking her phone to the bathroom, which she never used to do. She was secretive, guarded, like she had something to hide. The tension between us grew thicker, and it felt like I was walking on eggshells just trying to keep the peace. I wanted to confront her, ask her outright what was going on, but every time I worked up the nerve, I'd lose it. What if I was wrong? What if I accused her of something that wasn't true and ended up destroying our marriage over nothing? But what if I was right? What if she was already destroying it herself? I felt trapped in my own head, second-guessing everything, until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. So, I waited, hoping she'd come to me and tell me what was going on, hoping it was all just some misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew that the Rachel I fell in love with was slipping away, and the woman she was becoming was someone I didn't recognize. The thought of her with someone else gnawed me, made me sick to my stomach, but I needed proof. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. And that's when I decided to dig deeper, to find out once and for all if my wife was cheating on me. I couldn't get the thought out of my head, the idea that Rachel might be cheating on me. The suspicion gnawed me day and night, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I'd find myself zoning out at work, replaying our recent conversations and interactions in my mind, trying to catch any clue I might have missed. At home, I kept a closer eye on her, trying to figure out if I was just being paranoid or if my gut was right. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon. Rachel had been acting even more distant than usual, snapping at me over nothing, barely talking to me unless it was to criticize something I'd done. She told me she was going to run some errands, the same vague excuse she'd been using more and more lately. But this time, I wasn't going to just sit around and wait for her to come back with another weak excuse. I had to know the truth. As soon as she left, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I went through her phone. She'd been guarding it like a hawk lately, but today, she'd left it on the kitchen counter in her rush to get out of the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked it up, my hands shaking with a mix of guilt and fear. I knew it was wrong, but I also knew I couldn't live with this doubt any longer. The first thing I did was check her messages. Nothing unusual at first: texts from her friends, some family, and a lot of notifications from random apps. But then I saw it, a string of messages from a contact saved under a fake name, Jenny's mom. I felt a chill run down my spine. Rachel didn't have any friends named Jenny, and even if she did, why would she be texting with her friend's mom? My gut told me this was the lead I was looking for. I opened the chat, and my heart sank. It wasn't Jenny's mom at all, it was some guy named Nick. And their conversation wasn't about anything innocent. It was filled with messages that made my blood boil, plans to meet up, inside jokes I didn't understand, and worst of all, the kind of flirtation that leaves no room for doubt. It was clear from the messages that this wasn't some harmless friendship. It was something much, much more. But what really pushed me over the edge was the pictures. Nick had sent her selfies, the kind you don't send unless you're trying to impress someone, and Rachel had replied with pictures of her own. They weren't nudes, but they were close enough, pictures of her in outfits I hadn't seen before, looking at the camera with a smile I hadn't seen in months. The kind of smile that used to be just for me. I felt like I was going to be sick. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. This was it. This was the proof I needed, the confirmation that my wife was cheating on me. But instead of feeling relieved that I finally knew the truth, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My whole world was collapsing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But I wasn't done yet. I needed more. I needed to know exactly what was going on between them. So, I went through her call history, her photos, even her emails. And the more I dug, the worse it got. There were late-night calls to Nick, sometimes lasting for hours. There were photos of them together, nothing explicit, but the kind that left no doubt they were more than just friends. There were even reservations for dinners at places Rachel had never mentioned to me, and receipts for gifts that I'd never seen. It was like a bad dream, one that I couldn't wake up from. Every piece of evidence I found was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, another confirmation that the woman I loved had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And then, I found the messages that broke me completely. It was an exchange between Rachel and Nick, talking about a weekend getaway they had planned. They were discussing which hotel to stay at, what to do, and how excited they were to finally have some real alone time. That was when I realized this wasn't just some fling or emotional affair. Rachel had been planning to go away with this guy, to share a bed with him, to do God knows what behind my back. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I wanted to destroy something, to scream, to make Rachel feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But more than that, I wanted to confront her, to look her in the eye and demand to know how she could do this to me, to us, to our family. I couldn't believe that the woman I'd spent the last decade with, the mother of my children, could be so cold, so deceitful. But I knew I couldn't just blow up at her without a plan. I needed to catch her in the act, to confront her with undeniable proof so she couldn't weasel her way out of it with more lies. I needed to see it with my own eyes, no matter how much it might hurt. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. The next time she said she was going out to run errands, I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and followed her at a distance. My heart pounded the entire time, a mix of fear and adrenaline keeping me on edge as I tailed her car through the city. She drove to a part of town we rarely went to, parked in front of a small boutique hotel, and walked inside without a second glance. I waited in my car, my mind racing, knowing exactly what I was about to confirm. After about 15 minutes, Nick showed up, walking into the hotel like he'd done it 100 times before. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, watching the front door of the hotel and waiting for them to come back out. Hours passed. I don't know how long exactly. I lost track of time as I sat there, my mind a storm of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, they walked out together, laughing, holding hands like a couple of teenagers in love. The sight of it made me feel like my chest was being crushed. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, not even thinking about what I was doing, just needing to document the moment, to have proof of what I'd seen. Then I started my car and drove away, leaving them behind as I tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. When I got home, the house was empty, just like I knew it would be. Rachel had texted me earlier, saying she'd be home late and not to wait up. The lies were so casual now, so effortless. It was like she didn't even care if I believed her or not. I sat on the couch in the dark, staring at my phone, at the pictures of Rachel and Nick coming out of that hotel. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to confront her, to get answers, to demand to know why she'd done this to me, to us. But I also knew that once I did, there would be no going back. Our lives would never be the same again. And that's when I decided it was time to take the next step, to confront Rachel with the evidence I had and force her to tell me the truth, no matter how much it hurt. That night, I waited for Rachel to come home, stewing in my anger and anticipation. Every minute felt like an eternity as I sat there, thinking about what I'd seen, what I'd discovered. I kept imagining how the confrontation would go, how I'd confront her with the truth, how she'd react, what lies she'd try to spin to cover up her betrayal. I was ready for it, or at least I thought I was. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of facing her after what I'd uncovered. She finally walked in around 10 p.m., looking tired and disheveled, but there was a trace of that same smug smile she'd had when she walked out of the hotel with Nick. It made my blood boil. She tossed her keys on the table and gave me a half-hearted hey, barely looking in my direction as she headed toward the kitchen. "Rachel, we need to talk," I said, my voice cold and steady. She froze in her tracks, something in my tone catching her attention. She turned to look at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she was trying to figure out what I was getting at. "About what?" she asked, her voice just as cold. "About you, me, and what the hell has been going on behind my back," I replied, trying to keep my voice from shaking with the anger that was simmering just beneath the surface. She crossed her arms and leaned against the counter, her expression shifting to one of annoyance. "What are you talking about? I've had a long day, Mike. I'm not in the mood for whatever this is." I stood up from the couch, unable to sit still any longer. "Don't play dumb with me, Rachel. I know. I know about you and Nick." Her face went pale, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. But she quickly masked it with a sneer. "Nick? What are you talking about? There's nothing going on between me and Nick. Don't lie to me," I shouted, my composure finally snapping. "I saw the texts. I saw the pictures. And I followed you today, Rachel. I saw you with him at that hotel. That did it." The look of shock and guilt that crossed her face was all the confirmation I needed. She tried to recover, but it was too late. The truth was out in the open, and there was no taking it back. "You followed me," she hissed, her voice laced with fury. "How dare you spy on me? You're invading my privacy." "Privacy?" I shot back, incredulous. "You've been cheating on me, Rachel. How the hell do you expect me to react? You think I'm just going to sit around while you run around behind my back? You're the one who destroyed our marriage, not me." She glared at me, her fists clenched at her sides, clearly trying to figure out how to talk her way out of this. "It's not what you think, Mike. It's complicated. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I snapped. "I understand that you've been lying to me, sneaking around, having sex with another man while I've been here, taking care of our kids, trusting you. What I don't understand is why. Why, Rachel? What did I do to deserve this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned away from me, pacing the length of the kitchen, her hands trembling. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and trembling with barely restrained anger. "You want to know why?" she asked, her tone biting. "Fine, I'll tell you. It's because I'm tired, Mike. I'm tired of being stuck in this boring, dead-end life. You're always working, always too busy to pay attention to me. I'm stuck here with the kids, day in and day out, and you don't even notice that I'm drowning. Nick, he noticed. He made me feel alive again, like I was worth something. I stared at her in disbelief. So, what? This is my fault? Because I've been working to provide for our family? Because I trusted you to be my partner, to love me, and you couldn't handle it? Yes, she shouted, finally turning to face me, her eyes blazing with fury. You don't get it, Mike. You don't see me. You don't care about what I want, what I need. You just assume everything is fine because you're too busy with your precious job to notice that I'm falling apart. The anger I felt was quickly replaced by a deep, aching sadness. This was it, the truth. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I loved, was telling me that our life, our marriage, was nothing more than a burden to her. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, the wind knocked out of me. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But you should have talked to me, Rachel. You should have told me you were unhappy. Instead, you betrayed me. You betrayed our kids. She rolled her eyes, her anger morphing into something darker, something almost cruel. I did what I had to do, Mike. I needed to feel something again, something besides being a wife and a mother. I didn't want to hurt you, but I wasn't going to give up the only thing that made me feel alive. And what about us? I asked, my voice trembling. What about our family? Do we mean nothing to you? She hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of regret in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold, indifferent expression. I don't know, Mike. Maybe we were never meant to be happy. Maybe this was always going to happen. I felt the last bit of hope drain out of me. There was no saving this, no fixing what had been broken. Rachel didn't want to save our marriage. She didn't want to make things right. She was too far gone, too wrapped up in her own selfish desires to care about the damage she'd caused. So, what now? I asked, my voice hollow. Are you going to keep seeing him? Keep lying to me? Or do you want out? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at me, as if weighing her options, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. Finally, she shrugged. I don't know, Mike. I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that I'm not going to be the one who stays in a marriage out of guilt or obligation. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But I couldn't. I was too drained, too beaten down by the weight of it all. All I could do was stand there, staring at the woman who had torn my life apart, and wonder how the hell we had gotten to this point. Fine, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. If that's how you feel, then I guess there's nothing left to say. She looked at me for a long moment, as if she was expecting me to say more, to plead with her to stay, to fix what she'd broken. But when I didn't, she just nodded, a look of almost relief crossing her face. Maybe it's for the best, she said quietly, turning to leave the kitchen. Maybe we both need to figure out what we really want. I didn't say anything as she walked away, didn't try to stop her as she went upstairs to our bedroom, the place that had once been a sanctuary for us, a place where we were supposed to be safe from the world. Now it felt like the loneliest place on earth. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time after she left, trying to process everything that had just happened. It felt like a dream, like I was floating outside of my body, watching my life crumble to pieces in slow motion. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and I had to face it. When I finally made my way upstairs, Rachel was already in bed, her back turned to me, pretending to be asleep. I didn't even bother trying to talk to her. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I went to the guest room, closed the door, and collapsed onto the bed, feeling more alone than I ever had in my entire life. As I lay there in the dark, I realized that this was it. This was the end of our marriage, the end of everything I thought I knew about my life. And as much as it hurt, as much as I wanted to fight for what we had, I knew deep down that it was over. Rachel had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. I had to decide what kind of life I wanted to build for myself, for my kids, without her. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. The days after that confrontation were a blur. I felt like I was living in a haze, going through the motions of life while my mind was stuck in a loop, replaying everything Rachel had said and done. It was like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. The hurt and betrayal twisted inside me until they turned into something darker, something that demanded payback. Rachel acted like nothing had happened. She was still cold, distant, and indifferent, but she kept up the pretense of normalcy, especially around the kids. But I wasn't fooled. I knew what she was really like now, what she was capable of. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was her with him, laughing, holding hands, doing God knows what behind my back. The anger boiled inside me, and I knew I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't just let her get away with what she'd done to me, to us. So I started planning. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do at first, but I knew I needed to hit her where it hurt. I needed to make her feel the same pain she'd caused me. And I wanted to do it in a way that she wouldn't see coming, in a way that would make her realize just how badly she'd fucked up. It started small, almost as a way to test the waters. I began by subtly messing with her stuff, moving her things around, hiding items she used every day, things she couldn't easily replace. Her favorite makeup, her car keys, her phone charger, I'd hide them somewhere she'd never think to look, and watch with a cold satisfaction as she grew increasingly frustrated trying to find them. She started snapping at the kids more, getting irritable at the slightest inconvenience, and every time she did, I felt a twisted sense of pleasure. It was like I was taking back a little bit of control each time she lost hers. But that wasn't enough. Petty inconveniences weren't going to cut it. I needed to go bigger, to really make her suffer. That's when I decided to target something that mattered to her a lot. Her social life. Rachel had always prided herself on her image, on being the perfect wife, mother, and friend. She had a close-knit group of friends, and she loved nothing more than hosting dinners, organizing playdates, and generally being the center of attention. I knew if I could start unraveling that, if I could start pulling at the threads of her carefully constructed life, it would all start to come apart. I started by dropping hints to her friends. Nothing too obvious, just little comments here and there when I ran into them. Rachel's been so busy lately. I'm not sure with what though, or it's been tough, you know? Rachel's been distant. I think she's going through something. It wasn't long before the whispers started, the quiet judgments behind her back. I could see it in the way they looked at her, in the way they talked to her, a little more distant, a little more wary. Then, I took it a step further. Rachel was always meticulous about her social media. Her Instagram was full of perfect family photos, snapshots of our kids, carefully curated to show off the best parts of her life. So I started posting things on my own account, things that made it clear all wasn't well in paradise. I'd post cryptic messages, like "sometimes people aren't who you think they are," or photos that looked innocent enough on the surface, but with captions that hinted at something darker. Family dinner, but not all smiles tonight, or holding it together, one day at a time. People started noticing. I'd get messages from mutual friends, asking if everything was okay, if there was anything they could do. And I'd reply with vague responses, just enough to let them know that things were far from fine, but without giving away too much. I wanted them to wonder, to speculate, to start putting the pieces together on their own. And then, I went after her reputation at work. Rachel's part-time job was something she took pride in, even if it wasn't the high-powered career she once dreamed of. She liked being the competent one, the go-to person in the office, the one everyone could rely on. So I started planting seeds of doubt there too. It wasn't hard, I knew enough about her job, her coworkers, her schedule to start making things difficult for her. I'd call her office and leave anonymous tips, suggesting she was distracted, that she wasn't as focused on her work as she used to be. I'd send emails to her boss, pretending to be a concerned colleague, saying things like, "I'm worried about Rachel. She seems really off lately. I think something might be going on at home." It wasn't long before her boss started questioning her performance, asking her if everything was okay, subtly pushing her out of the projects she'd been leading. Rachel didn't know what was happening. She'd come home in a foul mood, complaining about how work was getting more stressful, how her friends were being weird with her, how nothing seemed to be going right. And every time she did, I'd just smile and nod, pretending to be the supportive husband, all while relishing the knowledge that I was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. But the real blow came when I went after something even more personal, her little side hustle. Rachel had started an online boutique a couple of years ago, selling handmade crafts and decor. It was her pride and joy, something she poured her heart into, and something that she hoped would eventually turn into a full-time business. She was good at it too. Her shop had grown steadily, and she had a loyal customer base. So, I decided to sabotage it. I created fake accounts, left negative reviews, spread rumors online that she was scamming people, that her products were shoddy and overpriced. I'd place orders and then cancel them at the last minute, leaving her with inventory she couldn't sell. I even went as far as to contact some of her suppliers, posing as a disgruntled customer, complaining about her business practices. It wasn't long before her sales started to drop, her once loyal customers turning away from her, her business slowly crumbling. Rachel was devastated. She couldn't understand why everything was falling apart all at once, why her life was unraveling in ways she couldn't control. She'd cry at night when she thought I was asleep, and I'd lie there, listening to her sobs with a cold, twisted satisfaction. She deserved this. She deserved to feel every ounce of pain she'd caused me, and more. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more thing I needed to do, one final act of revenge that would leave no doubt in her mind that she had fucked with the wrong person. I decided to humiliate her. Publicly. It was petty, it was cruel, but at that point, I didn't care. I wanted her to suffer. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done, in front of everyone who mattered to her. I waited for the right moment. There was a big event coming up, one of those charity galas that Rachel loved to attend. She'd been talking about it for weeks, planning her outfit, coordinating with her friends, making sure everything was perfect. It was the kind of event where she could show off, where she could be the center of attention, the perfect wife and mother in everyone's eyes. So I bided my time, waited until the night of the gala. I let her get all dressed up, let her play the role of the perfect hostess, smiling and chatting with everyone, acting like everything was fine. And then, in the middle of the event, when everyone was gathered, I made my move. I stood up in front of everyone, raising my glass for a toast. The room quieted down, all eyes on me, on Rachel, who was standing next to me, beaming with pride. And then, with a calm, steady voice, I said, "I'd like to make a toast to my wife, Rachel. To the woman who has lied, cheated, and betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. To the woman who thought she could get away with it. Here's to you, Rachel." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Rachel's face turned ashen, her smile frozen in place as the realization of what I just said sank in. I could see the shock, the horror in her eyes as she looked around, seeing the whispers, the judgmental stares from our friends, from people she admired, people whose opinions she cared about. She tried to laugh it off, to say I was joking, but the look on my face told her that I wasn't. I wasn't joking at all. And that's when she broke. She started crying, right there in front of everyone, pleading with me to stop, to not do this here, but it was too late. The damage was done. She had been exposed for what she truly was, and there was no going back. I walked out of that gala without looking back, leaving Rachel to deal with the fallout on her own. I didn't care what happened to her after that. I didn't care if she tried to explain it away, if she tried to salvage her reputation. All I cared about was the fact that I had finally made her pay, that I had finally gotten my revenge. When I got home that night, the house was dark and quiet. The kids were asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just blown through their parents' lives. I sat down in the living room, feeling a strange sense of emptiness wash over me. I had done it. I had gotten back at Rachel, made her feel the pain she'd caused me, but it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like anything at all. All it felt like was the beginning of something new, something uncertain, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But one thing was clear, there was no going back. The life we'd had, the marriage we'd built, was over. And now, it was time to figure out what came next. The satisfaction of publicly humiliating Rachel didn't last long. In the days that followed, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. I had exposed her, yes, but I still felt hollow inside. I knew deep down that as much as I'd made Rachel suffer, the real anger, the real hatred I felt, was directed at the man who had helped tear my life apart, Nick. He was the one who had wormed his way into my marriage, who had seduced my wife and turned her against me. And he hadn't faced any consequences yet. That needed to change. I knew I had to be smart about it. I couldn't just go after him in a blind rage, as much as I wanted to. I needed to hurt him in a way that would leave a lasting impact, something he wouldn't recover from easily. I needed to ruin his life the way he had ruined mine. The first thing I did was gather information. I knew bits and pieces about Nick from what I'd seen on Rachel's phone and what I'd learned from following her, but I needed more. I started by digging into his background, his job, his friends, his habits. It wasn't hard to find out where he worked. Rachel had mentioned it a few times when she talked about him. He was a mid-level manager at some tech company, the kind of guy who thought he was more important than he actually was. He had a decent job, a nice car, and from what I could tell, a pretty comfortable life. A life I was going to turn upside down. I started by finding out who his boss was. A quick search on LinkedIn gave me the information I needed, and from there, it was easy enough to get the guy's contact details. I crafted a detailed, anonymous email, making sure to include everything I knew about Nick's affair with Rachel. I made it sound like I was a concerned colleague, someone who had been disgusted by Nick's behavior and felt compelled to come forward. I included screenshots of texts, emails, even the photos I'd taken of Nick and Rachel together. I knew it would be enough to make his boss question Nick's professionalism, if not his entire position at the company. I sent the email late at night, knowing it would be one of the first things his boss saw the next morning. Then I waited. It didn't take long for the fallout to start. A few days later, I heard through the grapevine that Nick had been called into a meeting with HR. Apparently, my email had done the trick. There were rumors flying around the office about an inappropriate relationship, about Nick's behavior outside of work, and how it might be affecting his performance. By the end of the week, he'd been put on probation, pending an internal investigation. It wasn't the same as getting fired, but it was a start. I knew how much he valued his job, how much his identity was tied up in his career, and watching it unravel was deeply satisfying. But I wasn't done yet. Ruining his career was one thing, but I wanted to make sure he felt the same kind of personal pain I had. I wanted to get under his skin, make him suffer in ways that went beyond the professional. So, I started messing with his life in more direct ways. I found out where he lived, an upscale apartment complex across town. I started showing up at random times, just to see what his routine was like. I watched him come and go, taking note of when he left for work, when he came home, and who he interacted with. It didn't take long to figure out that he was a creature of habit, same morning jog, same coffee shop stop, same time leaving for work. It was almost too easy. One night, I decided to pay his car a visit. He had a sleek, black sports car that he clearly took pride in. I waited until it was late, until I was sure no one would see me, and then I slashed his tires. All 4 of them. I didn't just want to inconvenience him, I wanted to piss him off, to make him feel the frustration and anger I'd been carrying around for weeks. As I walked away, I imagined his face the next morning when he found his precious car sitting on flats, and it gave me a sick sort of pleasure. But even that wasn't enough. I wanted to see him suffer more directly, to confront him face to face, to make him understand that he had messed with the wrong man. I waited a few days, letting him stew over the slashed tires, before I decided to make my move. I knew where he liked to go after work, one of those fancy bars downtown where he could sip overpriced whiskey and pretend he was more important than he really was. I made sure to show up one evening, timing it so I'd catch him when he was there alone. When I walked in, I spotted him at the bar, nursing a drink and scrolling through his phone. He didn't see me at first, which gave me a moment to steel myself for what I was about to do. I walked up to the bar, sliding into the seat next to him. He glanced over, his eyes widening in recognition when he realized who I was. For a moment, he looked like he was about to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. "Nick, right?" I said, my voice calm but laced with venom. "Rachel's friend?" He stammered something, clearly caught off guard by my presence. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out what I was doing there, what I wanted. "Listen," he started, but I cut him off. "No, you listen," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You fucked with my life, Nick. You thought you could just swoop in and mess around with my wife, and I wouldn't find out? That there wouldn't be consequences?" He looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation happening in such a public place. "Man, I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he said, trying to placate me. "Rachel told me you two were having problems. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You didn't think, or you didn't care? You just saw an opportunity and took it, didn't you? You didn't care about what it would do to me, to my family." He flinched, and I could see the guilt on his face, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. "Let me make one thing clear," I said, leaning in close, my voice barely above a whisper. "If you ever go near Rachel again, if you ever try to contact her, I will ruin you. And not just your job, not just your car, I will destroy everything you have. Do you understand me?" He nodded quickly, his eyes wide with fear. I could see the sweat starting to bead on his forehead, and it gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. For the first time, he was scared, really scared. And it was because of me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'll stay away from her, I swear." "Good," I said, my voice cold. "Because if you don't, if you so much as think about her again, I'll make sure you regret it. This is your one warning, Nick. Don't make me come after you again." With that, I stood up, leaving him sitting there, pale and shaken. As I walked out of the bar, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. I had finally confronted the man who had helped destroy my life, and I had made sure he knew exactly what would happen if he ever crossed me again. In the days that followed, I kept an eye on him, just to make sure he was keeping his word. And to his credit, he did. I didn't see him near Rachel again, didn't catch any sign that he was trying to contact her. It was like he had vanished from her life entirely, and that was exactly what I wanted. But as much as I had wanted revenge, as much as I had needed to make him suffer, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't brought me the closure I was looking for. The anger, the hatred, the pain, they were still there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to consume me if I let them. I had made Nick pay, but I still felt empty, still felt like I was walking through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I had destroyed Nick's life, just like he had destroyed mine, but it hadn't made me feel any better. It hadn't erased the betrayal, hadn't undone the damage that had been done. It hadn't changed the fact that Rachel had chosen him over me, that she had been willing to throw away everything we had for a cheap thrill. And now, with Nick out of the picture, I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life, to figure out how to move forward in the aftermath of everything that had happened. But as I looked at the wreckage around me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was anything left to salvage, or if this was the end of the road for us, for me. Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, I had gotten my revenge, and I had made them both pay. And that was something, even if it wasn't enough. The weeks after I confronted Nick were a blur of emotions and restless nights. I had finally exacted my revenge, but instead of feeling satisfied, I was left with a gnawing emptiness. The anger that had fueled my actions was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache. I knew there was still one more thing to face, the hardest part of all, Rachel. We had been living in a tense, uneasy truce, avoiding each other as much as possible, barely speaking except when absolutely necessary. But I knew we couldn't keep going like this forever. We needed to have the conversation that would determine what happened next. We needed to talk about the end. One evening, after the kids were in bed and the house was quiet, I found Rachel sitting alone in the living room. She was staring at the TV, but I could tell she wasn't really watching it. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought, and there was a weariness about her that I hadn't noticed before. It was as if all the fight had gone out of her. "Rachel," I said quietly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." She looked up at me, her expression unreadable, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded and turned off the TV, folding her hands in her lap as she waited for me to speak. I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, keeping my distance, feeling the weight of the words I was about to say. I'd been rehearsing this conversation in my head for days, but now that it was actually happening, I didn't know where to start. This isn't working, I began, my voice heavy with resignation. We can't keep pretending like things can go back to the way they were. Too much has happened. We've hurt each other too much. Rachel didn't respond right away. She just sat there, staring at her hands, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, she sighed, a long, defeated sound that seemed to come from deep within her. I know, she said softly, barely above a whisper. I've been thinking the same thing. I just didn't know how to bring it up. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the enormity of what we were discussing hanging in the air between us. This was it, the end of everything we had built together, everything we had once believed in. We need to talk about a divorce, I said, forcing the words out before I could second-guess myself. It's the only way forward. We can't keep living like this, Rachel. It's not fair to either of us, and it's certainly not fair to the kids. At the mention of the kids, Rachel's expression softened, and I saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. She looked up at me, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. What about Jason and Emily? What are we going to do about them? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. They'll stay with you, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside. They need stability, and right now, you're the best person to give them that. I'll be there for them, of course. I'll be as involved as I can be, but they need to stay in the home they know, with the person they're most comfortable with. Rachel nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. She blinked them away, struggling to maintain her composure. I don't want to take them away from you, she said, her voice cracking. But you're right. They need a stable home, and after everything that's happened, I'm the one they need right now. Hearing her say that, acknowledging the truth of our situation, made it all the more real. The weight of our decision pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate me, but I knew it was the right thing to do. We couldn't stay together for the kids. It would only hurt them more in the long run if we tried to force something that was broken beyond repair. I'll make sure they know this isn't their fault, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We'll tell them together, when the time is right. They need to see that we still care about them, that we're still going to be their parents, even if we're not together anymore. Rachel wiped away a tear that had escaped, nodding in agreement. They're good kids, Mike. They'll get through this. We just have to make sure we're there for them, even if it's from different places. The sadness in her voice matched my own, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of regret. Not regret for ending our marriage, but regret for what could have been, for the life we had dreamed of but never fully realized. We had started out with so much hope, so much love, and now it was all crumbling into dust. Rachel, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that things ended up like this. I never wanted it to be this way. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. I'm sorry too, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I know I hurt you, and I can't take that back. I can't undo what I've done. But I'm sorry, Mike. I really am. For a moment, we just sat there, staring at each other across the chasm that had opened up between us. There was so much left unsaid, so many things we could have said or done differently, but it was too late now. The damage was done, and all that was left was to pick up the pieces and move on. I'll start looking for a place to stay, I said, breaking the silence. I'll find somewhere close by, so I can be there for the kids whenever they need me. We'll figure out the details, the custody arrangement, the finances, but I think it's best if we keep it as simple as possible. We don't need to drag this out any longer than necessary. Rachel nodded, her eyes downcast. I agree. We'll keep it civil. No fighting, no dragging each other through the mud. The kids don't need to see that. They've been through enough already. I nodded in agreement, relieved that she was on the same page. We'll make sure they know we both love them, that this isn't their fault, and that we're still going to be a family, even if it looks different now. Rachel looked up at me then, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. We did have some good times, didn't we? She asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. I couldn't help but smile back, even though it hurt to remember. Yeah, I said quietly. We did. There was nothing more to say after that. We had reached the end of our road, and now it was time to go our separate ways. As I stood up to leave the room, I glanced back at Rachel one last time. She looked small, vulnerable, like a shadow of the woman I had once loved. But I knew that both of us had changed, that the people we had been when we first met no longer existed. I walked upstairs to the guest room, where I had been sleeping for weeks now, and began to pack a few things. As I folded my clothes into a suitcase, I thought about what the future would hold for me, for Rachel, and for our kids. It was terrifying, not knowing what lay ahead, but I knew that staying in this toxic, broken marriage would only drag all of us down. When I finished packing, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the suitcase at my feet. It was such a small thing, a simple bag filled with my belongings, but it represented the end of an era, the end of a life I had once believed in. And as much as it hurt, I knew that leaving was the only way to start healing, the only way to rebuild my life from the ashes of what had been. The divorce would be hard, and the pain would linger for a long time, but it was a necessary step towards something new, something better, even if I couldn't see it yet. I stood up, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out of the guest room, closing the door behind me. As I made my way downstairs, I heard Rachel moving around in the kitchen, the soft clinking of dishes and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, my hand tightening around the handle of my suitcase. This was it. The end of our life together. But it was also the beginning of something new, something uncertain and terrifying, but also filled with possibilities. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and walked out the door, leaving the house, the marriage, and the life we had built behind me. Leaving the house that night felt like closing the final chapter of a book I hadn't wanted to end. The air outside was crisp, and as I walked to my car with the suitcase in hand, I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. I knew that this wasn't just the end of my marriage with Rachel, it was the end of the life we'd built together, the end of all the dreams and plans we'd once shared. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the house, at the windows that were once filled with the warm light of our life together. I thought about the kids, about how they'd react when we told them about the divorce, how they'd cope with the changes that were about to come. It broke my heart to think of Jason and Emily being caught in the middle of all this, their little worlds turned upside down because of the choices their parents had made. But I knew that leaving was the right thing to do. Staying would have only prolonged the inevitable, would have kept us all trapped in a situation that was slowly suffocating us. We had to break free, even if it meant tearing apart the life we'd known for so long. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I found a small apartment nearby, nothing fancy, just a place where I could start over. It was strange, moving into a new space, one that wasn't filled with memories of Rachel and the kids. The silence was deafening at first, but it was also a kind of relief, a clean slate, a chance to rebuild. Rachel and I agreed to keep things as amicable as possible. We talked to a mediator, set up a custody schedule that would work for everyone, and began the process of dividing our assets. It wasn't easy, there were moments of tension, of sadness, of anger, but we both knew that we needed to keep the kids at the forefront of our minds. The day we sat down with Jason and Emily to tell them about the divorce was one of the hardest days of my life. Rachel and I had rehearsed what we were going to say, but nothing could prepare us for the looks on their faces when we told them that we were no longer going to be together. Jason, being older, tried to act tough, but I could see the tears welling up in his eyes, his lips trembling as he tried to keep it together. Emily, on the other hand, burst into tears, clinging to Rachel and begging us not to split up. Rachel and I did our best to comfort them, to reassure them that we both still loved them, that none of this was their fault, and that we were still going to be a family, just in a different way. But the reality of what we were doing was too much for them to fully grasp. All they saw was that their world was falling apart, and there was nothing we could say to make it better. After that, things settled into a new routine. The kids stayed with Rachel during the week, and I had them on the weekends. I made sure to be as present as possible in their lives, showing up for school events, helping with homework, and doing everything I could to make sure they knew that I was still their dad, even if I wasn't living with them anymore. Rachel and I kept our interactions brief, civil, and focused on the kids. There was no point in rehashing the past, no point in dragging out the pain any longer. We both knew that we had to move on, that we had to let go of the anger and the hurt if we were going to build something new for ourselves and for the kids. The divorce was finalized a few months later. It was a quiet affair, just some paperwork, a few signatures, and then it was done. I walked out of the courthouse that day feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of finality. I was no longer Rachel's husband. I was free, but that freedom came with a heavy price. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into my work, trying to fill the void that the divorce had left. I spent as much time with the kids as possible, making sure that they knew they were my top priority. But there were still nights when the loneliness crept in, when I would sit in my apartment, staring at the empty walls, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I started seeing a therapist, someone to help me process the grief, the anger, the guilt. It wasn't easy, opening up about everything I'd been through, but it was necessary. I had to find a way to move forward, to make peace with what had happened, and to start healing. Through therapy, I began to understand that the end of my marriage wasn't just about Rachel's betrayal. It was about the cracks that had formed long before Nick came into the picture, the ways we had both failed to communicate, the ways we had drifted apart without even realizing it. It was painful to confront those truths, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I started to see a path forward, a way to build a new life that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past. Rachel and I remained cordial, if distant. We were no longer partners, no longer lovers, but we were still connected by the kids, by the history we shared. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the woman I had once loved, moments when we would laugh together at something one of the kids did, and for a brief second, it felt like old times. But those moments were fleeting, and they only served to remind me of what had been lost. As time went on, I began to open myself up to the possibility of finding love again. It was a scary thought, the idea of putting myself out there, of risking more pain, but I knew that I couldn't live the rest of my life alone. I started dating, slowly at first, dipping my toes into the water, trying to figure out who I was outside of my marriage. There were ups and downs, moments of hope and moments of disappointment, but I kept going. I knew that I deserved happiness, that I deserved to find someone who would love me for who I was, without the baggage of the past weighing us down. And eventually, I did meet someone. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, not like it had been with Rachel, but it was real, it was honest, and it was built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. She understood what I had been through, understood the scars that the divorce had left on me, and she was patient, kind, and supportive as I navigated the complexities of starting over. As our relationship grew, I began to see a future that wasn't defined by my past, a future where I could be happy, where I could build something new, something better. The pain of the divorce would always be there, a shadow in the background, but it no longer defined me. It was just one part of my story, a chapter that had ended, making way for a new one to begin. The kids slowly adjusted to the new normal. They still had their moments of sadness, of confusion, but they were resilient. They were stronger than I had given them credit for, and seeing them begin to thrive again gave me hope that we would all come out of this okay. Rachel, too, seemed to be finding her way. She had her own struggles, her own journey to navigate, but she was doing her best to be a good mother, to be there for the kids. We would never be the family we once were, but we were finding a way to be a different kind of family, one that was defined by love and respect, even if it wasn't bound by marriage. Looking back, I realized that the divorce, as painful as it was, had been a turning point. It had forced me to confront the realities of my life, to take responsibility for my own happiness, and to rebuild from the ground up. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought I wouldn't make it, but I did. I survived, and in the process, I found a new strength, a new sense of purpose. As I stood on the balcony of my new apartment one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew that I was moving in the right direction. I had closed the chapter on my life with Rachel, and now it was time to write the next one. It would be different, it would be challenging, but it would be mine. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.